Hi, I'm Natalie Morgan, CareerPlug's Senior Director of People, and I want to share with you 9 hiring biases that can hurt your recruiting efforts. Let's start by acknowledging that everyone has unconscious bias. As humans, we are very social animals with complex brains that have evolved little mental shortcuts over thousands of years to help us make quick decisions. Unfortunately, in modern life, this can often lead to some flawed decisions in the form of unconscious bias. In a hiring setting, unconscious bias can sabotage our efforts at recruiting and selecting the best candidates. By not being aware of the flawed shortcuts your brain makes, you could be missing out on a great hire. Worse, you could weaken your team by bringing in a bad one. Bias 1, the halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias in which we allow one obvious positive trait about a person to affect how we judge them in other unrelated areas. If a person is attractive, we might assume they're also intelligent, kind, and funny. This single obvious positive trait serves as a kind of halo that causes people to make false assumptions about their abilities or personality. Bias 2, the horn effect. This is the inverse of the halo effect. Rather than a halo bestowing positive attributes to a person, the horns are perceived negative attributes that cause you to jump to negative and equally inaccurate conclusions about a person. This hiring bias puts candidates at a significant disadvantage to overcome whatever the interview perceives as a negative quality. Bias 3, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to look for information that confirms a belief you already have and to subconsciously filter out all evidence to the contrary. Confirmation bias can be particularly dangerous when it involves making negative assumptions about groups of people that fall under the federally protected categories, including religion, national origin, race, color, sex, age, and disability. Bias 4, affect heuristic bias. Affect heuristic bias is a cognitive bias that uses mental shortcuts to make decisions heavily influenced by emotions. Research has shown that when you are in a positive emotional state, you are more likely to have a more positive, optimistic approach to making decisions. When you're in a negative emotional state, you can perceive options as having fewer benefits and more risks. For example, let's say in an interview, you notice that a candidate's keychain has the logo of your favorite college football team. Your emotional response is quick and positive. You've decided in a split second that you like this person. You could spend the rest of the interview riding that initial emotional wave of positive feelings. Bias 5, nonverbal bias. Nonverbal bias involves evaluating nonverbal communication like body language and giving it greater weight than we should. For example, there's a long-standing belief that a strong handshake is the key to success and a weak handshake is a red flag. But here's the thing, you can teach someone how to have a stronger handshake pretty easily. It's far more difficult to teach someone how to be a good fit for your company. Bias 6, affinity bias. The affinity bias describes our natural tendency to get along with people who are like us. It's easy for hiring managers to fall victim to affinity bias, especially when evaluating for culture fit. Remember to always look to your company's core values as the true North Star when it comes to evaluating culture fit, rather than someone who just shares your interests or your background. Bias 7, contrast bias. This hiring bias causes us to believe that a candidate is better or worse based on how we feel about another candidate. To prevent yourself from relying on feelings caused by contrast bias, make sure you're always measuring by the same predetermined metrics for every candidate. Bias 8, anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a trap we fall into when we have information that we become rigidly attached to. You can become anchored to the very first piece of information you receive about a candidate or your first impression of them in an interview. You can also become anchored to expectations that have nothing to do with the candidate, such as a precedent set by the previous person to hold the position. Bias 9, conformity bias. Conformity bias refers to our tendency to behave like others in a group, even if that behavior conflicts with our personal beliefs. You probably recognize this cognitive bias in its more destructive form, peer pressure. In a hiring setting, however, you'll want to ensure that you don't allow opinions of other stakeholders to sway your opinions about a candidate. We all have unconscious bias, but the first step towards removing bias in hiring is to acknowledge it when it crops up. Measure every candidate using objective criteria to evaluate consistently and make better hiring decisions. And ignore information that has nothing to do with a candidate's ability to perform the role, especially superficial traits. Until next time, happy hiring.